Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Chandris, and I am a linguistic anthropologist. I teach at the University of North Florida, and I'm really happy to be presenting virtually in your class today. I think at the time you're watching this video, I will be teaching my own class. I think my own linguistic anthropology class as well. So I'm grateful that I'm able to make this video resource for you all. And I'm excited to talk to you about linguistic anthropology. I made a brief PowerPoint to use along with this presentation, which I will share with your professor. And I have my contact information at the end, so please feel free to reach out and follow up with any questions or comments you have. I'm really grateful to also have received your questions. They are excellent, and I have a part at the end of the PowerPoint where I will answer them, but you will see that in a moment. Okay. There we go. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all of the different aspects that are part of being a linguistic anthropologist, and I will speak specifically through my examples of research, but generally this applies to all linguistic anthropologists. So what we will cover today is the topics anthropologists or linguistic anthropologists specifically study, and the topics linguistic anthropologists don't study. I'll tell you about my specific journey into linguistic anthropology, and which were some of your questions as well. So hopefully I'll answer those along the way. I'll explain my research and the methods that I use to complete this research. And then I will answer your questions and provide some additional resources if anyone is interested in pursuing this path as a subfield in anthropology. Okay, I'm happy to get started. So, linguistic anthropologists study basically anything to do with cultural interactions with language. This can be topics of linguistic variation within cultures, and then the list I have here. Language revitalization is a very popular topic, especially with indigenous languages, and this often goes along with cultural preservation. So remember, interactions with language and culture as a focus point. And some images there at the bottom is the indigenous languages spoken in parts of Mexico. And this has a near and dear place in my heart because this is where I started my linguistic anthropology career, even though what you've read for this class, obviously I now work in India. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But indigenous languages, cultural preservation is a big aspect of linguistic anthropology. Very broadly, discussions of power in language. This could be looked at in legal language, in law settings, in legal settings, in the courtroom. Who has power? How do they use language to negotiate or to maintain that power? Similarly, in medical settings, how do doctors and patients talk and interact, and where is power and authority in those types of communication settings as well? Also the topic that I explore and what you've read about, language ideologies, motivating beliefs that we have attached and maybe like assumptions that we have connected to language and varieties of languages, and therefore we extend them to attitudes we have about their speakers as well, values of language. Something that my advisor studied in anthropology were shifting language shifts over time. So how either meanings shifted in language or specific changes in language over time. These can be called language shift, and the very extreme sense, language death, when a language ceases to be spoken in a setting, not because people disappear or people die, but because there becomes a need for another language over maybe a language that was spoken before. So this is studied often with some of the big colonizing languages like English, how English has taken over some areas, and what happens to other languages that people speak there? Do they cease speaking it? Do they become relegated to certain domains, certain types of conversations? Changes overall in the cultural contexts of language use. Another topic that I study, connections of language with identity. So how does language relate to who we are? How does language help define who we are and continue that definition or change over time? Something that you might have heard in connection with this is code switching, where one stream of more linguists back in time study just the process of switching between one or more named languages or language varieties within a single sentence, or an interaction, a communication event, as some people call them, or how code switching also means that we switch our identities in different spaces. So I have a question for you about this. Do you speak the same way in classrooms as you do with your friends outside of classrooms? So this can be seen as a type of code switching if you have said no. Language acquisition as well. So first language acquisition, how children learn languages and how as children we are sponges taking in a lot of culture along with language from our environments and our caregivers and our peers as well. Also how adults acquire language, such as studying heritage languages, languages that with that process of language shift or language death, may be a language from one's past or one's cultural or ethnic roots that doesn't get spoken anymore or was never learned. This sounds pretty specific, and you'll see why, because this is also what brought me to linguistic anthropology. Finally, some newer sides of language and culture and communication that linguistic anthropology has turned towards is forms of language used in media and technology, language use through media and technology, how that changes, how language changes as we use it in different platforms, and what that does to our spoken languages too. So if anyone has ever said LOL out loud, that's something that's very interesting. A linguistic anthropologist would get very excited about that because it means that language that used to only be in writing is now shifting into speaking. Okay, and finally, nonverbal and written communication is also an important part of linguistic anthropology, and sign languages such as ASL, American Sign Language, and the cultural impacts and interactions of, for example, deaf communities and hearing communities. This is also a very rich area of exploration for linguistic anthropologists. So this is just sounds like a long list, but it really is a brief list of things that linguistic anthropologists study. You can see in this list, it's a lot to do with culture. It's a lot that you have probably touched on in cultural anthropology as well, if you've taken a class or have studied aspects of cultural anthropology in this class. And it's like looking at those aspects of culture through the lens or with the focus on language. But what do linguistic anthropologists not study? So linguistic anthropologists really look to observable data, just like all anthropologists. We are scientists, we are collecting evidence to make claims. So our evidence are observable aspects of human life. If you can collect data in an environment of living people, no offense, archaeologists, but material culture counts as a living environment, an environment that was lived in. But if you can do field work on the ground, not just with documents or language outside of a culture or context of use, such as structural linguists who are looking at grammar and syntax in ways that sentences are formed and not looking at cross-cultural connections, for example. So we look to observable data with language. We look to often contemporary situations of language. We focus a lot more on how language is used, not necessarily how language should be used, or how, if any of you ever got questioned in elementary school saying, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And the teacher said, "I don't know, can you?" That's not necessarily what we study, the proper grammar or polite etiquette, but the framework of that. Why is that important? Why does it matter that children need to learn the difference between may and can, that would be a topic for linguistic anthropologists. But obviously that is how language is used then within a particular cultural context. So anything to do with the brain as well, anything that focuses only on how the brain processes language or how language interacts in the brain is not generally something that is housed in the realm of linguistic anthropology because it isn't observable and it doesn't necessarily always connect with culture. Of course, if these are studied through cultural contexts or observations that have to do with something, the brain and language in a cultural context, that might be more in this realm. But these are usually in the disciplines of cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics. So ways that language happens in the brain, not generally within that observable environment that anthropologists in general study in. All right. Okay, next slide. There we go. Okay, so how did I get here? And a couple of you asked really wonderful questions about how I came to my topic of study, how I decided to study anthropology in general. So who you see there is little Jessica, long before the PhD, long before professor, doctor titles. I grew up in a multilingual household. My mom is American. She actually speaks sign language, though she is not deaf. My dad is from India, and he speaks English and Marathi, the language of the specific Indian state where he is from, and Hindi, a broader language that much of North India also speaks. So I grew up learning a little bit of Marathi at home, hearing it, certainly using it a little bit with my dad, but we grew up in my sister and I grew up in the United States. And as we started getting older, certainly when my sister's younger than me, when she was born, my parents sort of, had their hands full, raising two exuberant young girls. And my dad especially, defaulted to English. And there were also attitudes around this. There were attitudes of immigrant father coming from India, wanting to really establish himself in America and give his children the best opportunities that he can, opportunities that he may not have had in a rural, low-income setting in India. And English was a very powerful way to do that. So making sure that we had good English, making sure that we paid attention to what is considered good English and used it, those were concerns in my family. And so we stopped using Marathi. There wasn't so much of a use for it, as well as we got a little bit more distant from our relatives in India. And it also meant that my dad had made this successful life in the United States with his American daughters. So this might sound like a familiar story maybe to some of you and your upbringings. But it left me with a lot of questions, as it might you as well, of how language connected to my identity. I grew up in California. My family all lives in California now. And growing up in California and being half Indian, I definitely looked like I had some, or I do look like I have some Latin American heritage. So it brought up questions of, how does language connect to who I am? Am I less Indian if I don't speak an Indian language? How am I connected to my cultural heritage if not through language? And the funny thing is, in high school, having to learn or at least study a couple years of a foreign language, Spanish made the most sense. So I learned Spanish, and then that really confused people. But that was my entry point as well into connections between language and identity. And what sparked that was my own questions about language and identity. So I went to college. In high school, I decided I wanted to pursue this. So I applied to colleges that had a strong anthropology program, and I ended up at, this is actually the George Washington University was where I did my PhD. easy to confuse because I did my bachelor's at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I studied anthropology, and at that time, there were only cultural, biological, or archaeology fields of study. So I knew I wanted to study language, and it most closely related to the cultural anthropology stream. So I have a bachelor's in cultural anthropology, and I also minored in Spanish. I studied abroad, and through study abroad opportunities in Mexico and Spain, I developed undergrad research that I pursued into my graduate studies. I began researching language and identity among Indigenous speaking individuals in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and I wanted to pursue that. So to use my Spanish degree after I graduated with my bachelor's, I decided to join an English teaching program, and the one that was most available to me was in Spain, so or the Basque Country specifically. So I went after I got my degree to the Basque Country for 2 years, and I was an English language cultural assistant. And it was there that I started to develop an interest, not just in language and identity, but how language and identity became developed and changed in education specifically. So working in the Basque Country, the school that I worked at, and many of the schools in the Basque Country, the public schools certainly, are in the Basque language, Euskera. And the teachers, the city where I worked, everyone spoke Spanish at home mostly. There are places where people only speak Basque, but the place where I was working, people spoke Spanish at home, but I noticed that even though everybody spoke Spanish, the students had to speak Basque with people of authority, so teachers. And they knew I didn't speak Basque, but because I was in a teacher position, they would speak to me in Basque. And I thought that point of authority, that way that who is in what social position, who is in which status position, dictated what language was used. I thought that was really interesting. So I started to think about that a little bit more. And I applied into a dual master's and PhD program at the George Washington University, which is where I pursued my PhD. Yes, my master's PhD. So I decided to return to Mexico, and I proposed to do long-term research in Mexico on the topic of Indigenous languages and Spanish in classroom settings. And again, that element of authority, how students learn and change their language use, and what that does to their identities. My advisor, though, very excited about this project, wanted me to learn an Indigenous language, which is absolutely reasonable, and live in a monolingual Indigenous language speaking area. But, and this is an important piece of advice that I think I wish I was told as an undergrad, that if you're going to do research for maybe 5 to 10 years of your life, make sure it is on a topic that you enjoy. Make sure it is in a setting that you enjoy being in. So I started to get this anxiety feeling around going to a village, learning another language. And I thought about that for a while and realized if I have to learn another language, I want it to be Marathi. I want to learn the language that my dad speaks, that my relatives in India speak, because it's a lot of investment to learn another language. And language learning is often a really integral part of anthropological studies. So I decided to pivot my region of study, which is kind of odd to do, from Mexico to India. And I decided to kind of take the same questions and transplant them into a different context. And it fit really well, because India, similar to the area in Mexico where I was going to work, is a very multilingual area. But in India, I could live in a city. I could get to know my relatives. I could live a little bit more comfortably than maybe if I had gone to Mexico. So that was important to me. And within my PhD study, I got a year of funding to study Marathi in India. And I studied for 2 summers and then 1 full academic year. So I think in total about 13 or 14 months of language study. And then after my full year of language study, I stayed in India, and I spent 1.5 years collecting data in classrooms, looking at classroom discourse, which the article that you read is a result of my research. And after that, I actually spent another 6 months, another half year, starting to write my dissertation while in the field, which was very helpful because if I had questions or needed to follow up on something, I could go and access people a lot more easily than if I were in my university in Washington, D.C. So the culmination of all of that is this image you see on the screen. That is not me, but this is my book that just came out this month. And it is the dissertation that I wrote, wildly transformed, I think much improved on, into a book about how languages in India interact in classrooms, and specifically how there are attitudes and values attached to them, and how high caste individuals have they're in the driver's seat, really, in standardizing language and in passing on those attitudes about what is considered good language and what is considered proper language and what is considered the opposite, improper, bad language, which really there is no such thing as bad language, but there are attitudes that would tell us there is. So that is what the book became, and the book is out now. Okay, lots of time on this slide. Moving on, my research. So a little bit more about what I studied. The first project that I worked on is out of my dissertation, is from my dissertation project, and I'm working in India. So you see the map of India there, that's the state of Maharashtra, where I based my research. And my first project was in that location kind of in the middle of the state, Pune. So this is a city in India that's known for lots of educational opportunities, lots of good quality education. A lot of people travel there, not just from the state, but from the country, even internationally, to go to school, universities there. And what I wanted to look at, and what I did study, was then how different languages interact in the classroom. So the other images on the screen then is very typical image of a school, and you can see that there's a mixture of scripts and a mixture of languages as well. This is what students encounter. So a lot of English is seen as this language of progress, this language that will socially and economically as well, socioeconomically elevate one's status. So it is really common to have families want their children to study, if not entirely in English, then at least have a strong English class, or study English in some capacity in their schools. The image on the other side with the students holding signs is another example of this language mixture. This was actually the school where I did my dissertation research, one of the schools where I visited, where one of the examples comes from in the article you read as well. And you can see then signs are in mixed languages. The words that are in the other script, the Devanagari script, they are Marathi words. And this is, again, normal life for many students, for many Indian, at least urban residents, to see this mixture of language this way. One part of my dissertation was looking at the visual public of language, the linguistic atmosphere in the city, and seeing, if you can see in the background of that picture, there's a blue sign, and this is an English word, pantaloons. It's the name of a store. It's in the Roman script. Looking at what parts of the city had what kinds of scripts, what languages, what that might have told about the residents and the communities in those parts of the city, because there are important messages and subtle messages about where you see languages and the in-group and out-group connections that it makes. So either it brings people in, makes them feel like community, or excludes them. In places of the city where there's a lot of English, someone who does not have high English language skills might feel really excluded, and might feel like, oh, I don't belong here. This isn't my part of the city because I can't communicate, or I can't see my language reflected in the environment around me. So the project for my dissertation was taking a look at this whole city and the language context through the perspective of education in this city and what students are learning about language, what they're learning about the values attached to language and how that impacts their identities. So students coming from rural locations often felt behind, often felt less than students from the urban populations who had almost like a head start with English because there's more English in the urban context than in the rural areas. And students from rural areas had a really hard time in school because they didn't see themselves reflected in their school material, in their classrooms, and their teachers, and they struggled with language as well. My second project took me out of the city into a rural area, more towards the eastern side of the state in Maharashtra, in that map. So now I'm working on the topic of this low caste community, Banjara, and how they speak a specific language at home that's different than the state language in Maharashtra, which is Marathi. Each state in India, many states in India have a specific language, their own language. It's almost like different countries. India is like a country of lots of countries. So Banjara communities, though, are a little bit outcast. They were formerly nomadic and then forced to settle during the colonial period. So now there's groups sort of scattered all over the country and they retain their own language, but unlike Marathi, there's no state that is carved out for them and their language. So they find themselves, much like the urban or the rural students that I saw in the urban schools, at a loss. They feel left out. They have to play catch up to learn the language that school is in, which is in Marathi in these rural areas. So I've started working on this project with a couple other research collaborators, and we have so far concluded interviews that talked about the attitudes connected to language and what parents wanted for their children. We expected, so this is where good anthropology happens. We expected to find that people wanted, the Banjara families wanted more Banjara in the schools so that their children could see themselves reflected more in the school materials. But what we actually found was that nobody wanted this because they knew they needed Marathi to get ahead. So they wanted as quick as possible their students, their children to learn Marathi. It was often a very painful process of people learning Marathi at 4 or 5 years old when they started going to school and everything suddenly changed linguistically. So it was contrary to our assumptions and our initial feelings that parents would be okay with this, but that's what the data showed. So our findings emerge as we collect data. The other fun things that linguistic anthropologists get to do is teach. So I teach in the United States and I research in India in the summers. While I'm teaching in the United States, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and I started a couple other projects that are running during the school year. So I also work on interviewing with student research assistants about, or we interview Florida residents about their connections between language, usually English varieties, and their regional identity. So how does it feel being Floridian, and what does that tell you about how you speak or how you think others think about you and how you speak? Florida man comes up a lot in this. So the other project that I have running with a couple colleagues is about the anthropologist and author Zora Neale Hurston and her life that took place for some years in Jacksonville. So this one diverges a bit from language, but this is where I also get to use my cultural anthropology background and do some locally community situated anthropology research. Okay. So those are my projects that I have running. How do I do these projects? What do I do to get the data that I analyze? So these are a couple pictures, and I have another slide that shows even more of what we do. The picture on the left of me standing with a chalkboard and one of my research collaborators is what I generally do in the summer. which isn't teach actually. This was a picture taken of me teaching a lesson, a tongue twister, to a group of Indian students, Banjara students. But generally, I sit at the back of these classrooms and watch their teachers teach. And I watch how students interact with the teachers. So the method here is observation, participant observation, but usually I don't participate. I am here, but the observation component is noting down anything and everything that happens, as much as I can write down about the environment. So what does the classroom look like? How many students are there? Who's talking? Who's not talking? How are they seated? What is the flow of the lesson in the class? How does the teacher take questions? How do they respond to questions? Is there discipline? Is there something when a student gets something wrong? What does the teacher do? Do they get upset, or how do they receive incorrect answers, for example? So that's one method, observations. Transcription is a very important part as well. So I'm sitting here with a research assistant who was working with me over the summer as a translator and transcriptionist. So we are listening back to recordings that we made and writing down some important points of reference for what we hear about the languages that the kids were using as they played a game, and how they talk to each other. So a lot of sitting at a computer, typing, transcription, translation, and then that becomes our data that we analyze. Interviewing, though. Interviewing is an important part of research as well. And here are two images of interviews. Different settings. The one on the left is in this woman's home, and we're seated on the ground. You can see the recorder in front of me. I often try to record interviews because it captures more data. But you can also see my notebook in the corner too. So I'm writing down things as we are interviewing her as well. And then on the other side, this is with my two research collaborators there and a principal, the man all dressed in white. He's the principal of a school where we are sitting at, and we are talking to him about his work and his life. How he became a teacher, what he felt about the school. He was actually a couple of weeks from retirement, so he was very reflective about his time being a teacher and a principal. And this is a major component of where we get our data. And again, we see what emerges, what patterns come out. So this is how we found out that people actually didn't want more Banjara in the classroom. They wanted more Marathi so that their kids could learn it faster and assimilate for social survival. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and read from the compiled questions that your professor sent me. Let's see if I can pull them up. They were great questions. You'll probably hear me say, this is a great question after each question, because I thoroughly enjoyed seeing what interests you from the reading. Okay, so I think I've answered Jessie Katz's question and Emma Masak's questions about my background and my research. So Rodrigo Guzman Reyes talks about learning in that English in India tends to be used in formal settings, especially around figures of authority. And that's interesting you say that, because that also relates to my research that I did in Spain. So in the United States, the question is great because it asks me to apply this concept or framework that I saw unfolding in India in a very multilingual setting to English in the United States. So let's see. Yes, so Indian languages, informal, generally English language settings like an office. Many offices, there's lots of tech companies. The common language in these settings is English. It's also the language that the work is probably in too. So in schools, in offices, English might be this formal language, but knowing that there's lots of languages in India, lots of different languages for each state. And when two people from maybe the same state get to know that they speak the same language, they can use that language, and that signals that they have a specific closeness about their relationship, that they share maybe camaraderie, but like a similar background, a similar feeling, or they might understand each other a little differently than their other colleagues understand them, because the language signals having a shared or similar background. So it can signal closeness. Hindi can also do this. Let's see. In schools, and I haven't done observations in office spaces, but this certainly happened in schools where the formal language was in English, knowing that the lesson or the whole school was English only, or intended to be, as you read in the article as well. And breaking from English can signal to people that this is extra information, that this is non-content details. These are instructions maybe for an activity or for something, or that people are just generally chatting outside of the formal lesson content. So switching languages like that can relate to that. And let's see. Valeria Castillo, asking about challenges in my study, in my experience. How did I overcome it? The first thing that came to mind, of course, was language. Language was a huge challenge. Just understanding people, learning the language that people used in my research in Mexico and in India. A language barrier created a barrier to understanding culture as well. And it still is very much the most challenging aspect of my research. Where I work now in the rural area, there is such a different way of using Marathi that I have a hard time keeping up with conversations, which is why I had a translation assistant, research assistant working with me for translation and transcription this summer. So in some ways, it's interesting to not understand language, because you focus more on things like body language or other interactions going on without understanding the content. But definitely working as an anthropologist in a different cultural setting than one where I'm from, or where I spend maybe most of my time as I live and work in the United States, the switch between language and culture is definitely one of my largest challenges. So it's not just learning language, but it's learning the subtle meanings of language that you don't really learn from a textbook. As an example of this, walking into our dining hall this summer where we were staying while we did research, there was someone coming out who said, "Oh, you're just coming to lunch now," in Marathi. And then one of my research collaborators told her, "Yeah, we're late." And that was just the exchange. And I was like, we're not late. I looked at the clock and I said, "Oh, this is lunchtime. We're on time." And she was like, "No, no, no. That means that you're acknowledging, it's like a greeting. Saying you're late is like acknowledging that you're coming in, passing each other through this interaction." And I was like, where would I ever learn that? How would I know that? So it was learning those really subtle linguistic meanings that is very challenging. It's really learning the culture through language. So even though I grew up with my father and visiting relatives who are from this area, there's so much in daily, like everyday mundane language use that is so wrapped up in culture as well. I would say the second most challenging part of my research is gaining access to spaces. So a lot of my time is spent asking people, can I visit your classroom? Can I interview you? Okay, what time? When should we meet? Where should we meet? That access and coordination part is a lot of the research, without thinking or knowing that that was going to be a huge part of research going into it. So notice I didn't say the writing or the analysis. Those parts are really fun. Okay, from Caroline Salinas, do you think your research would differ drastically, say, if you researched in Mexico? And do you think you will continue this research beyond places in India, which is a great question. As I said, I was going to say with all of these questions. So I almost researched in Mexico, but linguistic anthropologists, like a lot of other subfields of anthropology, generally spend sustained time studying in one cultural space. So for example, one of my research collaborators is an education researcher. He is, his title is learning scientist. So he's not an anthropologist. He doesn't abide by our rules. And his discipline is more about jumping from space to space and setting up projects in different spaces. And that's very valued in his field. In anthropology, that would seem maybe a little wishy-washy, maybe not as deeply sustained in the culture, the deep relationships that we're expected to have and maintain over years, over lifetimes, sometimes with the people we work with. And notice I also said work with and not just study or our subjects. These are sort of bad words in anthropology because they indicate a steep and stark power dynamic. So we really try to equalize the power that we have between our interlocutors, the people we work with, and ourselves, because we're so beholden to them. It's without them, we wouldn't have the research that we do, that we can do, the access. So it's difficult to then change, which is why I said it was strange that I switched from studying in Mexico to studying in India. Most people pick a place and that's where they continue studying, in one place. After maybe getting established in these studies, I am really interested in studying in some comparative spaces and seeing how language plays out comparatively in education in other places. But I would still have this linguistic anthropology identity as a South Asianist, as someone who researches in India, because that's where I've done my most formative work. Let's see. Is there something else with that? Yeah, one way to jump into different contexts or different countries, though, is to see not just a comparative aspect, but if there's some link connecting your maybe original or most in-depth location for research with another place. That could be one way to jump from one to another and not be seen as sort of wishy-washy or like abandoning ship or something. So I traveled to Belize not too long ago, and I learned some really interesting things about the 3 official languages of the very small country of Belize and how English education is taught to the speakers of the other and very diverse varieties of language as well. So that would be something that I would love to explore more with the background, with the knowledge that I have coming from the Indian context into that one. Also at a conference recently, I met some linguists working in Sweden on some very similar issues with identity. So this could be something that I could jump into, study, and maybe look at in a short sense. But to really study in a place, you have to spend at least a year researching there. I think that's the standard. And then also consider learning about the history and beyond just the immediate contemporary time and place where you are. So it takes a lot of knowledge beyond just visiting a place, doing some interviews and seeing what comes out of those interviews. It's a lot more about relationship building and long-term sustained research. Okay, the caste system. So Edward Noah Delgado Ochoa, is the caste system still evident in India? And if so, how did it impact your investigation? Absolutely. I have so both of my projects have been focused around the caste system. And I actually consider myself, after doing this data collection, consider myself now a critical caste scholar, because a lot of my analysis focuses on how caste impacts language use. Funnily enough, before I went to India to start my research, I didn't want to talk about caste. And this can be seen as being colorblind, maybe. So I wanted to be caste blind. And that, as we probably know, it doesn't really work. So going into this project, my dissertation project, wanting to ignore caste, my project actually became completely about caste. And now I'm working on a project where it also is about two different caste groups and the language is attached to those castes, which is rare. Usually it's one language and different castes within that linguistic community. But caste is still a major part of how things play out in education, how identities are shaped, and how power is distributed. So caste used to be a social hierarchy more based on occupation, but it still is so much about social status that even if it's not tied to occupation, one can have the last name or the background as like weaver or bricklayer, something like that. But they don't have to be a weaver or a bricklayer anymore. They could be a scholar or a musician. But one's caste, which you're born with, will still follow them through life, and people will have attitudes about this. So it still impacts very much. It's still very much evident in India, and it impacts my investigation very much. And actually, so my family is from a high caste background, and as I learned the standard variety of Marathi, I learned that this variety of Marathi was actually a high caste variety. So as I learned and I began using more Marathi, people noticed, you're speaking like a high caste member, which actually was my family background. And then people who were of lower caste started to get a little wary of me. So as I learned the language more, instead of broadening my avenues of investigation, it actually narrowed it into more caste-based language spaces, and how caste then very much impacted what students learned and learned about language in school, learning that the standard is the good variety of Marathi, and that this is tied to very casteist ideas of social value, social status, and appropriateness as well. Okay, thank you for that question. Okay. From Alyssa Barreto, I understand that English, Marathi, and Hindi are 3 spoken languages in educational institutions. Does hypothetical reported speech help students learn more effectively than in classrooms where this type of speech isn't used? And it certainly didn't pop up in all classrooms. The examples that you read about in the article are few and far between, but I noticed that this pattern was doing something important in these spaces. So I definitely think it serves a purpose. I think it can do important work of building rapport among students and teachers, and maybe bridge an authority gap, as you saw in the article, when teachers code switched into another language. Sometimes it was a joking way, and then they could make their students laugh. They could feel a little bit closer to the students. That definitely, I think, serves an important purpose to facilitate learning and to facilitate teacher-student relations. And I think in some cases it can then also exacerbate the power status, which is actually the next question, Abigail, Christine. Similar question then. My work suggests that hypothetical reported speech helps to, in code switched into the mother tongue instead of English, reinforces and negotiates roles of status and power. And is there a comparative example in the United States? And this is actually the last question. So yes, again, great question. I think this is definitely more evident in multilingual settings, like in India, like in maybe American classrooms where there are students of multilingual backgrounds, students and maybe teachers of multilingual backgrounds. And code switching can carry messages apart from the content of what is said. So how things are said, the language they are said in, the language variety they are said in can sometimes build rapport, like with the last question. Say a teacher in the US, so in the US context, a teacher speaks Spanish and English, and either all the students or some of the students speak also Spanish, and the school is generally held in English. But knowing that the students speak Spanish, either all the students or some of the students, the teacher might use some Spanish. And this can create a certain level of comfort, maybe, if this is a language that students associate with comfort, with home, with friends, with family. This can show that there is something of a more informal relationship that can be forged. There can be more comfort and maybe ease, like easing anxiety or easing the fear that students have of teachers in this case can happen through those code switching languages. It can also reinforce status differences. For example, if this teacher speaks Spanish and uses it to mock or imitate real people or hypothetically inventing characters, this can reinforce a stereotype or indicate that the teacher is in a different position of authority over the students, like making fun of Spanish, showing that it isn't a part of a classroom language, and that it shouldn't be. For example, if it's the inappropriate way of speaking in class, then that further separates what students see as maybe a close comfort language to the outside community, the distant language of the classroom and their teacher in that case. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'll go back to my PowerPoint. Those were great questions. And I'll just share the last part of my PowerPoint with you. Okay, let's see if I can get it into the full screen. Oops, there we go. Great. So a picture of me where I'm looking a little bit more polished, without all these plant experiments behind me, although there are plant experiments behind me in that picture too. Great. Thank you so much for having me speak in your class. I am so happy to be able to visit and talk about my work as a linguistic anthropologist and the research that I get to do, that I love to do. If you have any questions for me, any further questions, or have inspiration sparked from this talk, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen. And if you want to explore more of what I've written about caste, language, identity, education in India, I have put 5 other publications on the screen that span the time I ended my PhD to just last month, actually. So you can see this is what I'm working on. And if you're interested in these topics, I would encourage you to read a little bit more. I also had, I think, another slide I skipped of, here we go, research on similar topics to mine, but in different contexts. So these are 2 examples of, these are 2 readings that deal with language ideologies, values attached to languages. If you're curious about that topic, but not necessarily the Indian context, I would recommend this article by Stacy Lee and Shalini Shankar's work. They're working with, again, this is mostly like South Asian, although I guess Asian students in Lee's work, but South Asian students in Shankar's work, and looking at the impact of an identity, an immigrant identity, or a minority identity in the United States as connected with language and power. So I would recommend these if you want to explore similar topics in different contexts, and I would recommend more of my work here if you want to look at some different sides of the same topic in the same context of India. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Be kind to your professor, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.